Good day. Yesterday, 11th May, was, if you believe the information from the Russian Defense Ministry, an absolutely horrific, totally disastrous day for the Ukrainian army. Not only were a string of villages captured by the Russian army in northern Kharkov, but Ukrainian losses over the entire battlefront were completely off the scale. If you add up all of the losses in manpower that the Russian Defense Ministry claims the Ukrainians suffered over the course of yesterday, then total losses, dead and wounded, that the Ukrainian military suffered across the battle lines came to over 1,600 men. Now, I'm not saying that that is the highest total suffered by Ukraine over the course of the special military operation, but it must be touching close to it. In addition, again, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, Ukraine lost a Patriot missile system close to the front lines, 3 Leopard tanks, a Caesar howitzer, all kinds of other valuable pieces of equipment. In fact, the number of artillery pieces that the Russian Defense Ministry says destroyed is just off the scale. And on top of that, apparently another ATACMS missile launched in some direction, or rather, we're not told where, was destroyed as well. By the way, so far, I don't know of any confirmed ATACMS missiles impacts anywhere over the line of contact since the ATACMS missiles reached Ukraine in March, earlier, a few weeks ago in March. There were some claims that some ATACMS missiles got through to the Jankoi air base. I understand that that is disputed, and those who have looked into this are questioning whether this is actually so. It's clear that no significant damage to the Jankoi air base in Crimea was really done. But anyway, it seems as if even if some of those missiles launched at that base did get through, according to the Russians, none of the others have. And we're starting to see some negative evidence of that, in that there seems to be a general shortage of confirmed ATACMS impacts on any part of the front line. Anyway, today that catalogue of disaster has continued. Just as I was preparing to make this program, we got a further update from the Russian Defense Ministry. They're claiming that over the course of today, that is to say up to the time of the making of this program, Ukrainian losses across the entire front lines, dead and wounded, came to another 1,500. And again, we have extraordinary catalogue of equipment losses, and not yet another Caesar howitzer apparently destroyed, for example. Some claims that an Abrams tank has also been destroyed, though I haven't seen that confirmed myself in the equipment totals. But anyway, more destruction, and in fact, I've just seen that they do claim an Abrams tank and another Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, along with M109 self-propelled howitzers and all that kind of thing. And the Russian Defense Ministry yesterday claimed that over the course of the 11th of May, the Russian forces in Kharkov region had captured 5 settlements. This morning, or rather this afternoon, they're claiming that the capture of a number of further settlements, Ukrainian villages in the Kharkov region, Gatishche, Krasnoye, Morohovets, and Oleniko. on Olenikovo. And to say again, what the Russian Defense Ministry claims on any particular day falls well short of what Russian reporters on the ground and commentators like Slavyangrad and Riba and Wargonzo and others are saying. If you put it all together, it looks as if the Russians have captured actually several more settlements over in Kharkov region, over and above the numbers that the Russian Defense Ministry are saying. And there are some reports this afternoon that they've now actually reached and entered the town of Volchansk, and that fighting is already going on for that town, which is expected to fall before long. Volchansk is a town of about 17,000 people before the war, so not perhaps a huge place, but not certainly bigger than a village. And anyway, apparently fighting taking place there as well. And, well, all of this is coming from Russian sources, but Ukrainian sources are becoming also extremely angry and very critical about the whole state of the situation on the Kharkov front. There's anger that the Russian volunteer units, which were apparently supposed to play a key role as some kind of a tripwire in the defenses, apparently they turned and fled and failed to withstand the Russian army. There's complaints that the fortifications and the minefields, which it might have been expected would be prepared, have not been prepared. President Zelensky and General Syrskyi are said to be furious with the local commanders. Just before I made this program, there was a report that the commander of the Ukrainian forces in Kharkov region has now been summarily sacked for failing to prepare for a Russian offensive, which had been trailed months in advance. Who his replacement is going to be, we will no doubt find out in due course. And we're starting to get some really alarmed and pessimistic comments about the situation from the Western media. Now, I have said before that the British media, surprisingly, is beginning to become a lot more factual about the war in Ukraine. They no longer write about it or report it as a thriller, or at least some parts still do. But some of the more purportedly serious newspapers are becoming more measured and more factual in their reporting. Anyway, yesterday we had a report from the London Times, and its title is "It was silent, then it was hell in the path of Russia's move on Kharkiv. A fierce battle is underway for Ukraine's second city as Moscow launches the biggest ground assault on the region for 2 years. Soldiers caught up in the fighting tell their story, and we're then told that the soldiers had spent almost a fortnight digging trenches day and night to deter Russian forces from crossing the border north of Kharkov. But at about 2 o'clock on Friday morning, the enemy came crashing through. Russia's new assault on Ukraine's second city had begun. It's important to stress that at the moment we don't yet know that the Russian objective actually is Kharkov city. But anyway, to move on. And then we have a platoon commander called Nikita saying it was silent at first, and then it was hell. We held the artillery, that's it. We stood watching it all. And then for the next 12 hours, he and his platoon tried to ward off Russian attacks, which came from multiple directions in the form of drones, artillery, tanks, and infantry. And the hardest part of the battle was the first 6 hours, as enemy forces moved through a border that had remained intact for over a year. We detained, repelled in full, and we inflicted a very big blow on them. We had no killed or wounded. That's what Nikita said. But others, apparently, who the military, the Times spoke to, well, they are not so sure. One of them, called Leo, says, "I saw other soldiers who were dead. The Russians went into the trenches." So clearly there is an advance. And at the end, we have a deeply pessimistic comment from a Ukrainian soldier. And we're told that Leo, who joined the army shortly after the invasion and has spent the past 2 years moving through various frontline positions, is not sure about victory. If the nation was united, we would have won already. Our nation, all people, are too fragmented. Asked if Ukraine could hope for eventual victory, he paused, slowly exhaled, and then replied, "No." And that's how the article ends. Well, this morning in the Daily Telegraph, we have another article. We're told that Russia seizes 9 villages in deep advance into Ukraine. Russia captured 9 villages in surprise invasion. In what way was this a surprise? Just asking. I've been hearing about the Kharkov invasion for months. In fact, it's been talked about incessantly. The chatter about it has been almost constant. But anyway, Russia captured 9 villages in its surprise invasion of Ukraine's northern border, the Kremlin said on Sunday. Troops advanced into settlements on the border with Russia's Belgorod region in an offensive that began on Friday. And we're then given factual information about the number of villages that have been captured. So there we are. It's clearly a major Russian advance in Kharkov region. And I'm going to make it now a few quick observations. First of all, it would be true to say that the major Ukrainian defense line has not yet been reached by the Russians. This has been fighting for various border villages, which the Ukrainians must have expected that the Russians would capture relatively quickly. Volchansk, of course, and the other important village of Lipsy, which apparently is also now under attack, they're a different matter. The Ukrainians would have wanted to defend them and perhaps hold on to them. But some of these other border villages that the Russians have captured, it's unlikely that the Ukrainians intended to defend them for very long. But if one compares the situation with the southern offensive that Ukraine launched in the summer of 2023, one immediately sees striking differences. Firstly, it's perfectly true that on the first day, the Ukrainians were able to capture certain villages that the Russians had occupied in advance of their main defense lines. But as I very well remember, immediately there were Russian counterattacks, and by the end of the first day, the Russians had recaptured nearly all of these villages. Fighting continued, and the Ukrainians never really managed to penetrate the forward control area in front of the main Russian defense lines, the Surovikin line. The main defenses were the Dragon's Teeth, the concrete pillboxes, the artillery positions, and the very elaborate system of trenches that the Russians created. The Ukrainians fought to reach that defense line. They just about came close to it near to the village of Verbovoye. In fact, there were even some photos of Ukrainian troops at one point photographing themselves close to some of the dragon's teeth, but they never crossed the major Russian fortified line, nor did they ever reach it in force, despite 4 months of almost constant and intense fighting. That's the first thing to say. Now, the other thing is, of course, that the Ukrainians also, over the course of their summer offensive, got trapped famously in these dense minefields that the Russians had created in the forward control zone. And again, one got the sense that the Ukrainians never really got on top of the problem presented by these Russian minefields. So let's look at what's happened in the Kharkov area on the first day. The Russians have captured all of these border villages. There appears to have been no resistance. The Russians are saying that a significant number of Ukrainian troops who are presumably defending these villages simply gave up and surrendered. Yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry reported that 34 had surrendered, which is a significant number. Since then, there are reports that there have been more surrenders still, and there's been no Ukrainian counterattacks to try to recapture any one of these villages. All of these villages appear now to be securely under Russian control. Secondly, I see no evidence for the existence of any minefields at all. The Russians are driving forward, and where one would have expected to see minefields, one sees none. We don't yet know what the state of the actual defense line that Ukraine has created is, but on the evidence of what's happening so far on the forward control zone, it looks as if Ukrainian defenses are threadbare. And over the course of yesterday, and by the way, of today, we are getting reports that the Ukrainians, Zelensky and Syrskyi, now becoming increasingly alarmed about a possible Russian breakthrough in Kharkov region, that they're pulling units from every part of the front line to try to plug this gathering Russian avalanche in Kharkov region. Now, I'm not going to try to itemize all the various brigades. I understand that the 42nd and 43rd mechanized brigades, which were located in the Chasiv Yar area, they've been pulled back and hurriedly sent to the Kharkov front lines. The 79th Brigade, which was the brigade which unsuccessfully defended Novomikhailivka, and which has been trying to defend positions in the Novomikhailivka Vukhlida area, it too is being redeployed, leaving only one brigade, apparently, defending this absolutely critical area. Other important units have been pulled back from the Avdiivka area as well. It's a general story of a major weakening of the entire Ukrainian front lines as the Ukrainians apparently struggle to hold the Russians back. And, well, we've had over the last couple of weeks constant chatter about a potential Ukrainian assault onto the east bank of the Dnieper River, in Krinky and other places. I've constantly said that I thought this was hopelessly misguided. Well, there are reports now that the Ukrainians are hurriedly redeploying all their forces from Kherson region, all 4 Marine brigades that were stationed there. Of course, these brigades have been in almost constant fighting. One brigade was badly damaged, as I remember, in the fighting in Mariupol in 2022. Then all four brigades, Marine brigades, Ukraine's Marine brigades, were deployed to try to capture the Vremivka salient. They suffered terrible losses trying to capture the villages of Staromayorsk and Orozhaine. Both of those villages, by the way, the Russians seem to be in the process of recapturing. Then those same four brigades were redeployed to Kherson region. They were the brigades that provided the men who were sent to Klinky, who were killed in horrific numbers. And now, with barely a break, they're being redeployed again, apparently, to Kharkov region, leaving Kherson region stripped of its best troops. So if there was some plan by the Ukrainians to launch some attack across the Dnieper to try to pin down Russian forces in Kherson region and to weaken the Russian advance in Kharkiv, we can see the opposite has happened. I always said that I thought this was a misguided strategy, and it looks as if, on the contrary, it was the Ukrainians who had diverted their troops from the key battle lines by all of these pointless attacks in the Dnieper area, and that they're now having to redeploy their troops in Kherson region to where they're really needed. And by the way, on that topic, some days ago, about 2 weeks ago, in fact, General Syrski proclaimed a major success in the Dnieper area. He said that an important island in the Dnieper, which would have been important if the Ukrainians really had been intending to conduct another landing operation in Klinky. Well, that island, we got confirmation yesterday in the Dnieper River, has now been recaptured by the Russians. There's actual film of Russian troops on that island raising the Russian flag. So the Ukrainians rushing to plug the holes in Kharkiv, pulling troops from the front lines, weakening the front lines in all sorts of places, and calling off whatever offensive plan they might have had in the Dnieper area. Now, all of this is very bad, but of course, it's even worse given that the situation on the various front lines was already bad previously. So we've had weeks now of Russian advances right across the line of combat. The Russians have achieved a major breakthrough in the Ocheretino, Avdiivka area. There are reports again this morning of further Russian advances. Again, it's difficult sometimes to keep up with all of the information, but there's reports now that the Russians have reached Kalinova village north of Ocheretino, and that they're preparing to storm this village. There's apparently fighting now going on in Novo-Alexandrovna, again north of Ocheretino, and apparently Riba is saying that the Russians have gained control of all of the territory to the southeast of this village, putting them in a strong position to launch that assault. There's been lots of reports about the fighting in Netalovo, which again I'm losing track of, to be frank, but it looks as if the situation there is rapidly coming towards a conclusion, with Ukrainian troops crumbling in Netalovo as well. This is another one of these villages to the west and north of Avdiivka. I discussed yesterday that in Krasnogorovka, the Russians appear to have pushed the Ukrainians out of pretty much the whole of the town, and that the Ukrainians are now present apparently in one area in the northwest of the town, and it looks as if the Battle of Krasnogorovka is definitely coming gradually towards an end. In fact, I've seen some reports that the only reason the Ukrainians are holding on to this area of Krasnogorovka is because it's essential that they hold on to it until most of their troops in Krasnogorovka are withdrawn. In other words, the force that is located there and which is resisting the Russians is a kind of rearguard force. That's one report, may not be true. But anyway, I can't be certain whether it's true or not, but I have seen that report and it's a plausible one. And lastly, there's lots of news now from Chasiv Yar. Now, yesterday I mentioned that General Pavlyuk, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, is hinting that Chasiv Yar might soon fall. He said, well, it's not really that important after all. If it does, something which, as I said, contradicts everything that Ukrainian officials have been telling us for weeks and what Western reporters have been saying for weeks. They've been constantly going on about the key strategic significance of Chasiv Yar, but General Pavlyuk has come along and said that it's not particularly important, which make me think that maybe the situation in Chasiv Yar is deteriorating. Well, shortly after General Pavlyuk spoke, Denis Pushilin, the head of the Russian-controlled Donetsk regional government, came forward and said that he did not expect Ukrainian resistance in Chasiv Yar to continue for very much longer. And in fact, over the course of today, we have received confirmation that there has indeed been a very significant deterioration of the Ukrainian position in Chasiv Yar. The Russians are now well inside the micro-district, and they're fighting, apparently, in some of the other northeastern areas of Chasiv Yar. I am not sure whether these areas lie beyond the canal, but I think not. But anyway, it hardly matters. And it seems as if also the Russians have captured a large area of territory into the southeast of Chasiv Yar on the east bank of the canal, and that they're now very close to being in a position to launch an attack on Chasiv Yar from across the canal from the southeast. So it looks as if Chasiv Yar, from which the Ukrainians have now had to redeploy troops in order to plug the gaps in Kharkov region, it looks as if the situation in Chasiv Yar is also approaching crisis. And as if Ukraine's problems were not great enough, we're also getting more reports this morning that there is another new Russian offensive being prepared, and this is further to the north and west of where the Russian troops in Kharkov region have launched their current attack, and that offensive supposedly is going to happen in Sumy region. And it's been suggested that this will be a smaller operation than the one we're seeing currently in Kharkov, but of course it will put more pressure on the Ukrainians. And by the way, it will be an operation much closer to Kiev itself. Now, note a few things. The Ukrainians have been informed, aware that the Russians were preparing some kind of offensive in Kharkov for weeks. It seems that the defences were not properly prepared, and it seems that the troops who were deployed to repel this operation were inadequate in number. Note further that Ukraine is not able to deploy reserves, apparently, to plug the gaps. It looks as if it's instead forced to redeploy troops from other parts on the front line. It looks as if the long, painstaking strategy that the Russians have been following throughout the war of grinding the Ukrainians down, depleting their reserves, is starting to bear fruit. The Ukrainians, instead of deploying fresh forces from their strategic reserves, are instead obliged to redeploy troops from various parts of the front lines. And note also that there appears to be uncertainty and chaos within the Ukrainian command. Again, one would have expected that the commander in Kharkov region would be a tried and tested and reliable officer. The fact that he's just been sacked after what looks like a collapse suggests otherwise. It suggests that there are problems in the Ukrainian command system, and that perhaps, just possibly, after the fall of Zaluzhny and the purges of the high command that Zelensky and Syrsky carried out following Zaluzhny's fall, that the caliber of Ukrainian frontline commanders has declined along with their morale. Lastly, a point I've already made, all the talk, all the investment, all the funds in creating defense lines so far seems to have achieved nothing. Maybe trenches and dragon's teeth have indeed been built in Kharkov region, but the forward control area was clearly not properly fortified, and there appears to be a general absence of minefields. Now, what's going to happen next? We shall see. It seems to me that the Russians are going to continue with the current strategy that they have. I think their focus is not going to be on Kharkov region. There is said to be panic in Kharkov city. The article in the Times that I mentioned actually refers to the fact that the mayor of Kharkov and the governor of Kharkov city are trying to reassure residents that an attack on the city is not imminent and is not likely to come. Maybe correct, we'll see. But there is said to be panic in Kharkov city, and this desperate redeployment of troops from the front lines and this dismissal of commanders, however, suggests that there is at least some panic in the command positions in Kiev itself. Now, so far, there's been less response from Western capitals. I'm not sure that they are absorbing this situation. Maybe if the Russian advance in Kharkov confines itself or is confined to the border areas, they'll breathe a sigh of relief. But maybe if we start to see further collapse in other places, if Chasiv Yar specifically falls at some point over the next few weeks, then I fully expect to see a new outbreak of panic on an enormous scale. And suffice to say that the fact that there is so much alarm and fear about what is going on is highlighted for me by another truly extraordinary debate that is actually taking place in Germany. Apparently, a group of German MPs, some from the CDU, some from the Green Party, are coming forward with a new crazy scheme. This is of deploying Patriot missile systems and air defense systems on the Polish and Romanian border and shooting down Russian missiles and presumably aircraft from these missile positions in Poland and Romania. What the Polish and Romanian governments would think of that, I have absolutely no idea. Let me repeat again, I think that if any such foolish thing is done, it will again invite Russian reaction. The Russians have repeatedly made it clear that if combat operations are conducted from the territory of third parties, they will respond. And I have no doubt at all that if, say, Patriot missile batteries and are stationed in Poland and Romania and attempt to intercept Russian missiles or shoot down Russian aircraft, the Russians will conduct strikes against them, even if they are located in Romania and Poland. At which point, of course, we're going to have a crisis of a sort that no one can imagine. It seems incredible that after the warnings that we have heard from the Russians over the last 10 days, warnings which resulted in the Russians conducting nuclear drills and giving explicit warnings to the British that if Britain were party to Ukrainian missile strikes on locations inside Russia, the Russians would reserve the right to launch counterstrikes against British military facilities across the world, including in Britain itself. Well, it seems incredible that even after these warnings, there appear to be people in Germany who aren't getting the message and who are going down this incredible and alarming and dangerous route. We'll see whether it happens. And I would point out anyway that with Patriot missiles apparently have a range of, some say 70 kilometers, others put it slightly higher at around 100 kilometers. Well, any Patriot missiles strung out along the border of Romania and Poland would not be in a position, it seems to me, to do anything about the ongoing catastrophe the Ukrainian army is experiencing in eastern Ukraine. And those Patriot missile batteries would not be able to defend Ukraine's cities along the Dnieper, Kiev, Kremenchuk, Dnipro, Zaporozhye, and all of those anyway. So an incredibly provocative act which could anyway only have a very limited effect. So anyway, a catastrophic day for Ukraine and, well, redeployment of forces from one part of the front lines to another part of the front lines might temporarily ease the situation where the moment of crisis is greatest. It is likely, however, to lead to further Russian advances in other parts of the front lines. And of course, it will burn up men and machines at an ever accelerating rate. It means that units will not be given time to rest, soldiers will not be given time to rest and to be rotated out of the battle or to be supplemented by reinforcements. The constant pressure on men in battle in this kind of situation is going to be unbreakable. It's going to be unbearable. And sooner or later, we're going to start to see soldiers breaking down. And, well, we already saw a significant number of soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, on the Kharkov border, apparently giving up without a fight. And I suspect we're going to see more of that happening as well. Aggressive attrition is still going on. It's now just reached a further upward level. It's putting pressure on the Ukrainians, which no army in the end is going to be able to bear. So there we are, a crisis on the front lines. Ukraine taken apparently by surprise by an offensive in the Kharkov area that has been discussed months in advance, and in contrast to the Russians, ahead of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, the Ukrainians have failed to prepare properly for Russia's Kharkov offensive, even though they were given plenty of notice that it was coming. Now, what else is going on in the world? As I said, at the moment, we're getting fewer reports of political reactions from the Western powers to this. The British have decided to send $500 million of aid to Ukraine. We're told that it will include 5 million rounds of small arms ammunition. Well, we've seen that before. Brian Beletic has pointed out many times that though that may sound impressive, small arms ammunition, bullets and that sort of thing, we're looking at just a few days of use by soldiers who find themselves in a combat zone. We're told that the British are going to supply Ukraine with 1,600 missiles, but we're not told what those missiles are or what they're going to be used for. Britain doesn't have 1,600 Storm Shadow missiles to supply to Ukraine. For the record, if we follow the Russian Defense Ministry, its updates, there's been a reduction in the number of Storm Shadow missiles being launched on the battlefronts. In fact, for several days, I haven't seen a single report mentioning any attacks by Storm Shadow missiles. No doubt we will get more at some point. But anyway, a reduction. I suspect that the 1,600 missiles are probably anti-tank missiles and man-pads and that sort of thing. Important and useful, no doubt, but hardly sufficient to change the overall situation on the battlefronts. And notably, it's notable that apart from the Bradleys that the Americans continue to supply to Ukraine in dribs and drabs, though the Russians now seem to be destroying Bradleys faster than the Americans are replacing them. But apart from the Bradleys, the Americans are sending, and the Marders, the Marder infantry fighting vehicles, that the Germans from time to time also send. The heavy tracked infantry fighting vehicles that assault troops need in order to break through strong defense lines. We're not seeing many reports of these being sent to Ukraine anymore, and we're not getting many reports of further tank deliveries from the West either. And about shell deliveries, well, also, there again, we've had fewer reports as well. So what are the Western powers going to do? Well, one person has been telling us for months that he has a plan and that if elected, he could end the war in Ukraine over the course of a single day. And that is Donald Trump. Now, he's been very cagey about what his plan is, but I've seen some leaks which appear to give us an idea of what Donald Trump might be thinking. Firstly, it says that he wants a ceasefire along the existing front lines, and he wants the ceasefire to be followed up with talks between Russia and Ukraine. He says that the question of Ukraine's NATO membership will be postponed, not certain until which date. Apparently, Ukraine is not going to be asked to agree to the permanent loss of its territories, the territories that it once returned, but it's expected that somehow or other the Russians and the Ukrainians will nonetheless come to terms. If the Ukrainians agree to negotiate, then the United States will continue to equip them and arm them, so it will continue to do that, presumably during the period of the ceasefire. And the Russians supposedly can expect sanctions relief, in other words, all the sanctions, to be lifted, but that will only happen once the agreement between Ukraine and Russia has been made. There is absolutely no possibility that the Russians will ever agree to a proposal of this kind. If this is the proposal that is being floated, then it is the same as the freeze proposal that was floated by Richard Haass and others in the Council of Foreign Relations last year. And the Russians have repeatedly rejected it. There is no conceivable way that the Russians are going to agree to negotiations or to freeze the conflict on the basis that the United States can still arm Ukraine and is still keeping the option of Ukraine's membership of NATO indefinitely open. And as for an offer that one day, if an agreement is reached, the Russians might, just might, see some lifting of sanctions. The Russians won't believe that. They won't believe that the sanctions will ever be lifted. I'm sure they expect that the Congress, the Senate especially, would move to block any move in that kind of context to lift the sanctions. So the Russians are not going to agree to something which they know will never happen. In fact, in some respects, this bears some resemblance to the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement was also a settlement freeze. There was supposed to be a withdrawal, a conflict freeze. There was a freeze on the front lines. The Ukrainians were supposed to agree to pull the heavy weapons from the line of contact, which of course they never did. There was also an assumption that the West would stop arming the Ukrainians. President Obama said that was official US policy, but of course the Western powers did arm the Ukrainians, and the Russians were told that the sanctions that were imposed on them in 2014 would be lifted. But of course, that was made conditional on the Minsk agreement, resulting in a full settlement, which of course the Ukrainians never agreed to do. They sought to rewrite the Minsk agreement to completely change its sequencing, in effect, to turn the entire Minsk agreement upside down. There is no conceivable way that the Russians are going to go through all of that all over again, or agree to what apparently Donald Trump is thinking of proposing to them. If this really is Donald Trump's plan, then it will fail on the first day. In fact, it won't fail on the first day. It will not even be agreed to on the first day. The Russians will simply ignore it. They'll just go on and push forward. And as far as they're concerned, a proposal like this might as well not exist. I do wonder who exactly is advising Donald Trump, assuming, of course, that he's obtained advice and that this is a plan that he's prepared on the basis of that advice. It seems to me, once again, that if this is indeed the actual proposal, which, by the way, I suspect it is, that Donald Trump is working with, it's another sign, it's a further sign of Western inability to grapple with the realities of the entire Ukraine situation. The West has never wanted to accept that for the Russians, NATO membership of Ukraine is a red line. Even despite the fact that the US's own ambassador to Moscow, Bill Burns, who's now the director of the CIA, warned them that that would be the case. And even though a whole reserve army of principally US former diplomats and Russia experts, George Kennan, Chaz Freeman, Jack Matlock, any number of others also said that that would be the case. And the West also continues to have an exaggerated belief in the power of its sanctions weapon, which seems really remarkable given the fact that it has been deployed against the Russians now for 10 years. It will be 10 years in June since the first sanctions, the first sectoral sanctions, were imposed on Russia. In the context of apparently an intelligence report by Germany's intelligence service, the BND, that if, following the imposition of these sanctions, Putin didn't come to terms, the Russian oligarchs would overthrow him and in order to get the sanctions lifted, something which never happened. Anyway, that was 10 years ago. That was what was suggested then. As I said, the sanctions didn't significantly affect the performance of the Russian economy. It continued to grow despite the sanctions. And of course, there was no rebellion by the oligarchs and no change of Russian policy with respect to Donbass or Ukraine or Ukraine's NATO membership. Anyway, despite this catalogue of failure going all the way, all those 10 years, it seems that there's still this constant belief that somehow or other, some way or other, if the sanctions are preserved, the Russians will eventually, out of desperation to have them lifted, that they'll come to terms. The fact that their economy is now growing rapidly, that their country is reindustrializing, that they're developing all kinds of new high technology, high technologies, and setting up new plants and factories, and that real wages are rising and that living standards are growing. Well, all of that apparently is only ephemeral, at least so Westerners insist on believing, and provided you stay the course with the sanctions, the Russians will eventually crumble and come to terms. And the same magical thinking, that was that famous article in the Wall Street Journal last year, which spoke about Western magical thinking, though it engaged in quite a lot of magical thinking itself. The same magical thinking applies in terms of Western policy towards the other great adversary superpower, which is China. Now, there's been an article about this by Martin Sandu, a prominent commentator in the Financial Times. And I think this article, again, mirrors again very closely Western thinking, or at least the thinking of part of the Western political establishment about China, and about how China can also be somehow brought into line and can perhaps be persuaded to pull the West's chestnuts out of the fire in Ukraine. And this is connected to Xi Jinping's recent trip to Europe, which I discussed extensively in my program yesterday. Over the course of that trip, as we know, Xi Jinping went to Paris and he had a meeting there with President Macron of France and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission. I said in my program yesterday that, contrary to what most Westerners think, that was not the most important part of Xi Jinping's journey, at least not in my opinion. I think much more important for Xi Jinping was his visit to Serbia and Hungary. I think that the Chinese, like the Russians, have come to understand that the Europeans, for the moment at least, are in effect a lost cause, and that Xi Jinping and the Russians, alongside the Russians, are instead now focusing on building up strong relationships with certain selected European countries in Eastern Europe, with a view to establishing a long-term footprint and bridgehead in Europe. But of course, Martin Sandu doesn't see things in that way. He sees it instead purely as a visit by Xi Jinping to France and some kind of dialogue between the Chinese and the European Union. And he goes on to ask this: what most profoundly do Europe and China want from one another? Europe rightly deems Russia's assault on Ukraine existential for its security and its liberal democratic way of life. China has taken the other side. Europeans also fear China is sabotaging Europe's green tech self-sufficiency by flooding it with cheap products. Beijing wants a multipolar world order which requires preventing Europe from aligning too closely with a US agenda of technological containment and French shoring of supply chains. This is coupled with a domestic growth agenda premised on exporting large amounts of green tech, which requires keeping rich country markets open. Now, I've never seen any Chinese official or commentator say that the Chinese have a domestic growth agenda premised on exporting large amounts of green tech, which requires keeping rich country markets open. That's Martin Sandhu's belief. I think it's the belief of many people in the West as well. But I just wanted to say again, this is not something I've ever heard any Chinese official say. And then he goes on to say both sides want to prevent the EU-China relationship from turning into a tail wagged by the US dog. Here is the making of a grand bargain. It would require both sides to move on from entrenched positions to reap greater advantages elsewhere. The key is to crystallize the nature of the choices. For China, having to choose between Russia and Europe. For the EU to choose between China's support for Russia's war and its role in supplying Europe. If Macron is serious, he would seek to induce China to distance itself from Russia in return for a secure commercial presence in Europe. Xi would hardly disown Vladimir Putin publicly, but could Beijing effectively stop material support and sanctions circumvention and tacitly cease opposing a confiscation of Russian state assets? Europe would not sign a death warrant for its green manufacturing sector, nor ignore hybrid security threats, but could it recalibrate its green transition to make ample room for both EU-made and Chinese products, accommodating China's commercial plans? And then we're told that that France is ideally placed to propose this kind of grand bargain. It could offer the Chinese a concession of letting China in further into Europe as the European power most sensitive to threats to disinvest from Euro government bonds should the EU confiscate Russian state assets. It has the most to gain if Beijing scales down its solidarity with Moscow. Europe cannot agree to wiping out of its industry, but it needs all the green tech it will get. For example, adding even the scariest estimates of Chinese EV exports to EU's own capacity falls short of what is needed for Europe's 10 million or so annual car registrations to be emissions-free by 2030. So this is the proposal. This is the proposal that Martin Sandhu, and I suspect others, and I would not be surprised if this is actually a proposal that's been, in a kind of a way, put to the Chinese, maybe even by Macron himself to Xi Jinping over the course of his visit to Paris. This is the proposal. Stop supporting the Russians. Don't give them dual-use technologies. Enforce our EU sanctions against them. Agree, or if you don't exactly agree, don't object if we confiscate Russian assets, the entire 270 billion. And in return, we're prepared to allow you to export a certain amount of your goods, your electric vehicles, to Europe. We're not, of course, exactly saying how much, and of course, we're not going to let you export so much that it would affect our own plans to build our own electric vehicle production. but we will allow you to export a little, or perhaps more than a little, if in return you agree to throw the Russians completely under the bus. In effect, it's a bribe to Beijing. Why would Xi Jinping agree? First of all, he would know perfectly well that even if the Europeans, in theory, were to promise not to impose those restrictions on Chinese EV imports, the EU, sooner or later, will impose restrictions on EV imports. The United States, by the way, is said to be planning now to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese EV vehicles that are imported to the United States. It is inconceivable that the Europeans will not at some point agree to do the same. When have they ever resisted an American demand to restrict imports from China or Russia, if it comes to that? And the Europeans are not going to change their policy on this. So, in return for a bribe that is almost certainly not going to be honored, the Chinese are asked, in effect, to cut themselves loose from a strategic partnership with Russia, which they consider vital for their own geopolitical position and their ultimate security. It's not going to happen. But again, strange assumptions here that provided you offer this kind of bribe, provided you exert a little pressure, major powers like China and Russia will take steps to sacrifice their fundamental interests in order to satisfy your obsessive concerns. If Xi Jinping was offered a deal like this, which in effect, by the way, well, if he were to agree to such a thing, not only would the offered bribe not be paid, but it would almost certainly open the way to further demands on all sorts of other things. If Xi Jinping were offered a proposal like this, he will have come away from his meetings with Western officials even more convinced than by now he probably already is, that doing deals with the Western powers is hopeless. The Chinese position, continuously restated by Chinese officials at every opportunity, is that they oppose the politicization of trade issues. As the world's major trading country, that is obviously a fundamental position for China to take. It is fundamentally in its interests for it to take it. It's not going to agree to, in effect, politicize trade issues in this way by agreeing to any kind of linkage, even unacknowledged linkage of the sort with the Ukraine war, of the sort that the Europeans are demanding. Well, there we are. Magical thinking with the Russians, apparently in the United States, affecting even Donald Trump, from the Europeans towards China. I have to say, I'm coming increasingly round to the bleak view that this conflict in Ukraine is going to end only when the Russians decide that it will. I think that the Russians, certainly they're going to press on to liberate the whole of Donbass. I think that they will want to bring Zaporozhye and Kherson back under their control. I saw a report somewhere that the Russians have said or have hinted that they would not insist upon the Soviet-drawn administrative boundaries of Kherson region being abided to in any political settlement, that they might be prepared to give up Kherson region west of the Dnieper River, including the city of Kherson. I have never seen a single Russian comment, certainly not one from any Russian official, that has ever said any such thing or hinted at any such thing, given that Kherson region, west of the Dnieper River, as far as the Russians are concerned, is now Russian national territory. I think for the Russians, it would be impossible to do that under the terms of their own constitution. And as I have said many times, contrary to what Westerners like to believe, I think the Russians do take the provisions of their own constitution very seriously. So I think the Russians will fight on until the four regions, at least, are liberated, as they would put it. I think the Russians, if they occupy large areas of Kharkov region, or perhaps even the entirety of Kharkov region, if they capture all of the territory east of the Dnieper, all of this Russian territory, all of this territory east of the Dnieper River, more likely than not, at some point, they're likely to conclude that it too is Russian territory. After all, Kharkov historically was a Russian city. Just saying. I think that the Russians would probably, at some point, decide to incorporate this territory also within their boundaries. Note that in its military update, the Russian Defense Ministry, in reporting the capture of all of these settlements on the border, all of these settlements in Kharkov region, uses the term liberated when it refers to them. Liberated from whom? Doesn't that imply that Ukraine is occupying this territory and that it is properly speaking Russian? Just saying. Anyway, I suspect that the Russians will, at the very least, want all of this territory incorporated into their own country. What plans they have for Ukraine west of the Dnieper, I do not know, but I think it will be the Russians ultimately who will decide what happens there. I think that in the end, the Western powers are not going to intervene, but I think that their magical thinking, their inability to put behind them all of these strange conceptions and bizarre schemes that they have stand in the way of their recognizing the realities and coming to the terms that they need to do. And I think, lastly, that all what this means is that relations between the Western powers and Russia are going to be heading for the deep freeze for a very long time. And I think that before long, the West is going to find itself in some kind of conflict of some sort with China too. And I don't think that there is any advice, any counsel, anything that anyone can do that can prevent these things from happening. Anyway, that's where I'm going to finish this program today. Rather bleak thoughts, but there we are. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget that you can check out our shop. You can get yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.